always thought that old houses had a way of hiding secrets, but nothing prepared me for what my partner and I uncovered in ours. We bought the house on the outskirts of town, a quiet, unassuming structure with creaking floors and a basement that smelled faintly of damp earth. It wasn't love at first sight, but the price was right, and we were eager to transform it into our dream home. Yet, from the start, an inexplicable unease clung to the building, a murmur of things better left forgotten. During the first few weeks of renovations, I began noticing small oddities. A door that led to a dead end, a mirror reflecting shadows that shouldn't have been there, and noises that resembled whispered conversations in the dead of night. My partner shrugged off these occurrences as the quirks of an aging structure, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The turning point came one rainy afternoon. We were clearing out the basement, a cavernous space, filled with discarded relics of previous tenants, when my shovel struck something solid behind a section of the wall. Curiosity overcame caution as we carefully pried away old plaster, revealing a hidden door obscured by a false wall. The wood was warped and covered in dust, its iron handle cold and unwelcoming in my hand. With a deep breath, I pushed it open. The chamber beyond was small and claustrophobic, its air thick with the scent of decay and time. Sunlight barely filtered through a grimy window, casting long shadows across stacks of yellowed newspapers, brittle personal diaries, and faded photographs. I felt an immediate chill, a primal warning echoing in the silence. I could almost hear the heartbeats of those who had once inhabited this forsaken place. I picked up one of the diaries, its cover cracked and brittle, and began reading. The entries were disturbing in their candor, chronicling a series of domestic crimes that sent shivers down my spine. The writer described brutal acts of violence, secret torment inflicted on unwilling victims, and a pervasive dread that lingered in every corner of the house. The narrative was unadorned and disturbingly mundane, as if the atrocities were part of everyday life. It was clear that the author had suffered, or worse, perpetrated, horrors that defied explanation. As I leafed through more pages, I found references to a previous occupant who had mysteriously vanished, leaving behind a legacy of unspeakable acts. Local records later confirmed that several unexplained disappearances had once plagued this neighborhood, the cases forever left unsolved. The weight of the words pressed down on me, and I realized we had stumbled upon a hidden chapter of the town's dark history. That night, sleeplessness gnawed at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, as though the very walls of the house remembered every agonizing moment. My partner noticed my unrest, but his reassurances felt hollow. Over the next several days, strange occurrences escalated, footsteps echoing in empty halls, whispered voices that dissolved into silence when I strained to listen, and a shadowy figure glimpsed at the edge of my vision. The unease turned into a creeping terror that invaded my every waking moment. Driven by a need for answers, we contacted the authorities. Their investigation confirmed the grim past documented in the diaries. Neighbors began recalling whispered rumors of disturbances and unexplained disappearances decades ago. The investigation dredged up a series of long-buried secrets, a history of violence so deeply rooted that it seemed to infect the very foundation of our home. Despite the mounting evidence, many details remained frustratingly ambiguous. A missing timeline here, an unexplained entry there. It was as if the past was determined to remain a puzzle, a reminder that some horrors can never be fully unraveled. The day the case was closed, the investigators left with more questions than answers, and I was left to grapple with the realization that our lives had been irrevocably altered by the discovery. We tried to resume our renovation work, but the atmosphere in the house had changed. Every creak, every whisper, reminded me of that hidden chamber and the unspeakable events recorded within its fragile pages. Now, as I write this, I sit in a quiet corner of the living room, the remnants of daylight fading into shadows. The house remains our home, but the basement is forever sealed, a silent monument to a past that refuses to be forgotten. I still hear the echoes of whispered voices at night and wonder if, somewhere in the darkness, those long-dead secrets are still waiting for their moment to resurface. I can only hope that by keeping this part of the story hidden away, the horror will remain confined to the past, even as it continues to haunt my every thought. Looking back, I realized that the basement was not just a physical space beneath our feet. It was a gateway to a truth so disturbing that I sometimes wonder if some doors, once opened, are best left alone. I've worked in construction and renovation for over 15 years, and I've seen my fair share of strange things buried behind old walls, hidden rooms, forgotten photographs, even the occasional relic of a previous owner's life. But nothing comes close to what I found in the basement of the Caldwell mansion. The Caldwell property was one of those grand estates that looked like it had been pulled straight out of the 1800s. Nestled on a sprawling piece of land at the edge of town, it had sat vacant for decades, its once imposing presence now swallowed by overgrown hedges and weathered stone. A real estate developer had bought the place, intending to restore it and sell it off as luxury condos. My team and I were hired for the first phase of the renovations, starting with the foundation. From the moment I stepped inside, the house gave me a bad feeling. I chalked it up to the dust-covered furniture and the eerie silence that filled every room. The mansion was massive, with endless hallways and rooms that seemed to fold in on themselves. But the basement was what really got under my skin. It was deeper than a normal basement, almost bunker-like, with thick, uneven stone walls. The air was stale, carrying the kind of dampness that clings to your skin. There was barely any light. Down there, just a single, weak bulb dangling from the ceiling. As we worked, I kept feeling like someone was watching us, though every time I looked up, there was nothing but shadows. A few days in, we started knocking down a sagging section of the wall. The bricks crumbled easily, almost like they had been hastily patched up. As we cleared the debris, I realized we had uncovered something unexpected. A doorway. No blueprint had mentioned a hidden room, and yet there it was, concealed behind a shoddy layer of bricks. Curiosity got the better of me, and with a little force, I pushed the door open. The space inside was small, almost suffocating, with walls covered in faded wallpaper that curled at the edges. There was no furniture, just stacks of old, yellowed letters, a few scattered photographs, and a single leather-bound journal resting in the center of the floor. I hesitated before picking it up, feeling an inexplicable dread settle in my chest. The first few pages seemed normal, detailing mundane daily life in the mansion. But as I flipped through, the tone shifted. The writer described a world behind closed doors, a house ruled by fear and control. There were accounts of servants disappearing overnight, whispers of rooms that no one was allowed to enter, and the pervasive feeling that someone was always listening. One entry, dated sometime in the 1960s, mentioned hidden cameras long before. Home surveillance was common. The writer, who seemed to be a housekeeper, spoke of being watched, manipulated, and threatened into silence. As I kept reading, the sense of unease grew stronger. There were references to punishments, eerie accounts of people being locked away, and hints that even family members weren't spared from whatever cruelty had taken root in this place. A sudden noise behind me made me jump. It was faint, like the shuffle of footsteps. I turned sharply, my heart pounding, but the basement was empty. The only sound was the quiet creak of the house settling. Still, I felt an overwhelming urge to get out of that room. I snapped a few photos of the journal's pages and backed away, closing the door behind me. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured the journal's descriptions of the basement, of people begging through locked doors, of screams that went unheard. The next morning, I showed my findings to the project lead, who immediately called the authorities. The investigation that followed was unsettling, to say the least. It turned out that the Caldwell family, once one of the wealthiest in the area, had been notorious for their secrecy. Rumors of mistreatment and manipulation had swirled for decades, but nothing had ever been proven. However, when forensic teams combed through the hidden room, they found more than just letters. There were scratch marks on the inside of the walls, desperate, clawing from people trapped inside. The remains they uncovered were even worse, decades-old bones, buried beneath the foundation, their presence raising more questions than answers. Who were they? Servants? Family members who had fallen out of favor? No one knew for sure. The news of the discovery shook the community. Many people had looked up to the Caldwells, never suspecting the darkness that had festered beneath their feet. The mansion was no longer just an old house in need of repairs. It was a monument to suffering hidden behind wealth and status. The developers halted the renovations indefinitely, and I haven't set foot in that basement since. Sometimes I wonder what other horrors the house is still hiding. How many secrets remain undiscovered within its walls? One thing is for certain. I'll never take a job in an old mansion again. I've been managing renovations at the Ashford Apartments for nearly a decade, but nothing ever prepared me for what I discovered last fall. I'm the building's superintendent, and while many tenants whispered about strange happenings, I always chalked it up to the quirks of an aging structure. That all changed one gray, overcast day when routine repairs turned into something far more sinister. The complex was old, built in the 1960s, with creaking hallways and stained carpets that held decades of secrets. The landlord, Mr. Ashford, an elderly man with a reserved demeanor, had recently decided it was time to renovate the basement storage rooms. He'd always maintained that every inch of the building had a story, and I thought his words were simply nostalgic ramblings. I was tasked with overseeing the demolition of a sealed-off storage unit in the basement that had never been used. It was tucked away behind a false wall in a corner, isolated from the usual maintenance routes. As I prepared the area for demolition, I couldn't help but notice a series of small, unsettling details. There were odd, muffled sounds that seemed to emanate from behind the walls, like soft footsteps and quiet whispers when no one else was around. On more than one occasion, I caught a glimpse of a shadow moving just beyond the reach of my flashlight. At first, I assumed it was a trick of the light or my tired mind playing games, but the feeling of being watched grew too persistent to ignore. The day we tore down the wall, the air was thick with anticipation. I was working alongside a maintenance worker named Jerry, a no-nonsense guy who'd been with the complex for years. As we dismantled the decaying bricks, a loose stack of old cardboard boxes came tumbling down, scattering their contents across the concrete floor. That's when we saw it, a narrow opening concealed behind the fallen boxes. My heart pounded, as I realized it led to a hidden room, never intended to be seen. Stepping inside, I was hit by a wave of stale, oppressive air. The room was cramped, barely large enough to move around in, with walls lined in peeling, faded wallpaper. On a rickety wooden table, I found a collection of personal belongings, a bundle of faded photographs, a battered diary with a cracked leather cover, and a meticulously marked calendar whose dates were circled and annotated in what looked like shaky handwriting. I had a strange sense that these items were remnants of a life steeped in secrets. Curiosity overtook me, and I opened the diary. The entries were written in a hurried script, detailing the isolated life of a tenant who had apparently lived in silence within these very walls. This person had chronicled every visitor, every neighbor who came and went, often noting suspicious behavior and unexplained absences. As I read further, a pattern began to emerge. Names of residents who vanished without a trace, and notes that hinted at a shadowy under-the-table network exploiting vulnerable tenants for profit. The diary's tone was cold and analytical, as if the writer had been documenting not just life in the apartment, but a calculated system of abuse and control. A sudden clatter behind me made my blood run cold. I spun around, convinced that someone, or something, was lurking in the darkened corridor. But there was no one there, only the echo of my racing heartbeat. The oppressive silence of the hidden room seemed to amplify every sound, every whisper of wind that found its way through the cracks in the walls. Disturbed and unsettled, I gathered the diary, photographs, and calendar, and left the room with a heavy sense of foreboding. I reported my discovery to Mr. Ashford, who immediately called the authorities. In the days that followed, police combed through decades-old records and interviewed longtime residents. What emerged was a chilling picture of systematic exploitation and corruption. A network that involved respected community figures, hidden in plain sight for years. Even now, as I write this, the memory of that hidden room continues to haunt me. The Ashford apartments stand as a monument to secrets and betrayal, and I can't help but wonder how many more dark truths are concealed behind the facade of everyday life. Some doors, I've learned, are best left unopened, their mysteries lingering in the shadows, a silent reminder of the horrors that can exist in the most unexpected places.